Incident at the window. It chanced on Sunday, when Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk with Mr. Enfield, that their way lay once again through the by-street, and that, when they came in front of the door, both stopped to gaze on it. "Well," said Enfield, "that story's at an end at least. We shall never see more of Mr. Hyde." "I hope not," said Mr. Utterson. "Did I ever tell you that I once saw him, and shared your feeling of repulsion? It was impossible to do the one without the other," returned Enfield. "And by the way, what an ass you must have thought me, not to know that this was a back way to Dr. Jekyll's. It was partly your own fault that I found it out, even when I did." "So you found it out, did you?" said Utterson. "But if that be so, we may step into the court and take a look at the windows. To tell you the truth, I am uneasy about poor Jekyll, and even outside I feel as if the presence of a friend might do him good." The court was very cool and a little damp, and full of premature twilight, although the sky high up overhead was still bright with sunset. The middle one of the three windows was halfway open, and sitting close beside it, taking the air with an infinite sadness of mind, like some disconsolate prisoner, Utterson saw Dr. Jekyll. "What, Jekyll!" he cried. "I trust you better." "I am very low, Utterson," replied the doctor drearily. "Very low. It will not last long, thank God." You stay too much indoors," said the lawyer. "You should be out, whipping up in the circulation like Mr. Enfield and me." "This is my cousin, Mr. Enfield, Dr. Jekyll. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn with us." "You are very good," sighed the other. "I should like to very much, but no. It's quite impossible. I dare not. But indeed, Utterson, I'm very glad to see you. That is really a great pleasure. I would ask you and Mr. Enfield up, but the place is really not fit." "Why then," said the lawyer, good-naturedly, "the best thing we can do is to stay down here and speak with you from where we are." "That is just what I was about to venture to propose," returned the doctor with a smile. But the words were hardly uttered before the smile was struck out of his face and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below. They saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down. But that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street, and it wasn't until they had come into a neighboring thoroughfare, where even upon a Sunday there were still some stirrings of life, that Mr. Utterson at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes. God forgive us, said Mr. Utterson. But Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously, and walked on once more in silence. The last night. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner, when he was surprised to receive a visit from Paul. "Bless me, Paul, what brings you here?" he cried, and then, taking a second look at him, "What ails you?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." "Take a seat, and here's a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now, take your time, and tell me plainly what you want." "You know the doctor's ways, sir," replied Paul, "and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid." "Now, my good man," said the lawyer, "be explicit. What are you afraid of?" "I've been afraid for about a week," returned Paul, doggedly disregarding the question, "and I can bear it no more." The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. Even now, he sat with the glass of wine untasted in his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. "I can bear it no more," he repeated. "Come," said the lawyer. "I see you have some good reason, Paul. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is." "Foul play!" cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. "What foul play? What does this man mean?" "I daren't say, sir. I think there has been a foul play. But will you come along with me and see for yourself?" Mr. Utterson only answered was to rise and get his hat and great coat, but he observed with wonder and greatness the greatness of the relief that appeared upon the butler's face, and perhaps with no less, that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying rack of the most diaphanous and loamy texture. The wind made talking difficult, and flicked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. For struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. The square, when they got there, was all full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Poole, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish, for his face was white and his voice, when he spoke, harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are, and God grant there will be nothing wrong." "Amen, Paul," said the lawyer. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Paul?" "It's all right," said Paul. "Open the door." The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook, crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson!" ran forward as if to take him in his arms. What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer peevishly. "Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased." "They're all afraid," said Paul. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. "Hold your tongue," Paul said to her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentations, they had all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. "And now," continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle, and we will get this through hands at once." And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him, and led the way to the back garden. "Now, sir," said he, "you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go. Mr. Utterson's nerves, at this unlooked-for termination, gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. But he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theatre, with its lumber of crates and bottles, to the foot of the chair and the foot of the stair. Here, Paul motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. "Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you," he called, and even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. A voice answered from within. "Tell him I cannot see anyone," it said complainingly. "Thank you, sir," said Paul, with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. "Sir," he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eye, "was that my master's voice?" "It seems much changed," replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look. "Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. "Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's mad away with. He was made away with 8 days ago, when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there, is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson." "This is a very strange tale, Paul. This is rather a wild tale, my man," said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. "Suppose it were as you suppose. Suppose Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered. What could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason. Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I will do it yet," said Paul. "All this last week you must know him, or whatever it is that lives in this cabinet, has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine and cannot get it to his mind. It was sometimes his way, the master's, that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. We have had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints. They have been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought him the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it, because it was not pure, another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. Have you any of these papers? Asked Mr. Utterson. Paul felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus: "Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Messrs. Moe. He assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purpose. In the year 18, Dr. J. purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous care, and should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J. can hardly be exaggerated." So far the letter had run composedly enough, but here, with a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. "For God's sake," he added, "find me some of the old." "This is a strange note," said Mr. Utterson, and then sharply, "How do you come to have it open?" "The man at Moe's was main angry, sir, and he threw it back to me like so much dirt," returned Paul. This is unquestionably the doctor's hand, do you know? Resumed the lawyer. I thought it looked like that, said the servant rather sulkily, and then, with another voice, But what matter, hand of right, he said. I have seen him. Seen him? Repeated Mr. Utterson. Well, that's it, said Paul. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, and whipped up upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills, sir. If that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I have served him long enough, and then... The man paused and passed his hand over his face. These are all very strange circumstances, said Mr. Utterson, but I think I begin to see daylight. Your master Paul is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and his avoidance of his friends. Hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that he be not deceived. There is my explanation. It is sad enough, Paul, aye, and appalling to consider. But it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us from all exorbitant alarms. Sir, said the butler, turning into a sort of mottled pallor, that thing was not my master, and there is the truth. My master, here he looked round him and began to whisper, is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. Utterson attempted to protest. Oh, sir, do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door? Where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir. That thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll. And it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done. Paul, replied the lawyer, if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feeling, much as I am puzzled by this note which seems to prove him to be still alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door. Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking, cried the butler. And now comes the second question, resumed Utterson. Who is going to do it? Why, you and me, sir, was the undaunted reply. That is very well said, returned the lawyer, and whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see you are no loser. There is an axe in the theatre, continued Paul, and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself.